Today's conversation is speaking about the ERG leadership structure and roles that you need in your company and the ones that you need to let go. Really quickly, I always like to start off these sessions with the 3 rules of the ERG movement. These are the foundational principles behind the ERG movement. Number 1, your ERG program must operate as a business enterprise. I say that very intentionally. I'm not saying your ERG program should operate as a business unit. I say business enterprise, specifically meaning just like a successful business runs is how your ERG program needs to run. It sounds overwhelming, but by being part of the ERG movement, free community, a ton of information on the ERGmovement.com, that's where you get resources to learn how to do that. I've successfully done it and have completely changed the course of multiple ERG programs. Rule number 2. Your ERG program must benefit both the members that exist within the ERG's community and also the business that it operates within. Right now, you'll see a lot of ERG programs focus on benefiting specifically the business as a BRG, or they claim to just be an affinity group, which benefits just the members, but that's not an option anymore that you choose. It has to do both. And rule number 3, your ERG program must have a solid foundation. Otherwise, it will fail. And that's unfortunately what we've seen with a lot of ERG programs in general right now, is that their foundation, how they were started, was not strong. So that's why there's a lot of missing pieces when it comes to ERG programs operating without a strategy, without a clear vision, without metrics, without a really solid ERG leadership structure and SOPs. Those are the 3 rules. I always like to start the conversation on that because you'll see how they apply throughout this conversation. So, officially excited to get into it here. How this session is going to go. I'm going to go over why it matters that you have a solid ERG leadership structure. Then I'm going to touch on the 2 structures that I see most common, which would be the 4C pillar ERG leadership structure. I'm not a fan of it, but we'll talk about why I'm not a fan of it. And we'll also talk about ERGs that operate on just a co-chair, like, oh yeah, we just have co-presidents or something like that, but not specified roles, and why I also don't recommend that. After that, we'll touch on the actual ERG roles that I feel that every ERG should have and why. We'll even get into what an SOP, standardized operating procedure, would look like for each of those roles and success metrics for each of those roles. So I'm excited to get into it. And let's go. Okay, thing 1, why does it matter? Like, as long as ERGs are running, does it matter if the ERG what the ERG leadership structure is? I have here 8 reasons that we're going to go through. Reason number 1, clarity of roles. When there are clear roles in place, there's a lesser chance, the chances of like the balls being dropped in your ERG decreases dramatically. Misunderstandings, this is what I do in the ERG, that conversation is so much clearer because everyone knows their part in bringing the ERG's goals and vision to life. So just everyone being really clear on what they bring to the table with the ERG and what they're supposed to do. Clarity of roles. Thing 2, better decision making. In this case, and we'll talk about this a little bit soon, I always prefer going more so towards a specialist model within a leadership structure over a generalist model. What do I mean by that? Let's just say hypothetically that you injured your head, you feel like you might have a concussion. Would you rather go to a general surgery doctor, or would you rather go to someone who is specializing in head trauma and things like that? So obviously the person who specializes is someone who you would feel more confident to handle your situation. When you have a really clear ERG leadership structure, you have specialists who are able to make better decisions to help solve problems. Specialists get things done. Generalists get burnt out. Please remember that. So better decision making comes along with it. Increased accountability. Individuals can now be held accountable for their actions if they have a clear role. Without clear roles, it's impossible to say the ball was dropped because this person didn't do it. Now, that sounds kind of harsh, but honestly, there's no way to perfect the process if there isn't that accountability. So now that someone's accountable for it, you can find out why the ball was dropped. And then you can dive more into how you can implement systems or things in the future that make it harder for those same mistakes to happen more than once. But without a clear leadership structure, it's going to be hard to hold people accountable and then to solve problems in that way. On the flip side of that, the good thing about having increased accountability is now ERG leaders can feel that sense of responsibility for the role that they're in. If it's clear, they can really feel ownership of certain metrics that role is responsible for and moving the needle on. And then even think when it comes to performance reviews, it's going to be that much easier for them to articulate what they've done with the ERG, how they've done it, what numbers they move, what strategies they implemented, because it was focused on one specific role versus, once again, that generalist approach. So it benefits them even when it comes to performance reviews. That's a really big selling point for those of you who are looking to potentially relaunch your program, or if you're looking to implement this sense of uniformity across all of your ERGs within your company. This is a really big selling point because sometimes I have experienced pushback, but when you say, if you have this clear role, you'll actually be able to speak to how you move our Slack engagement score. I'm getting too much into what we're going to talk about, but that's really going to be a really big selling point to get the buy-in from the ERG leaders to be uniform across ERGs. In addition, I kind of touched on this too, they'll have specific goals that they're now accountable for. This is good because without a clear leadership structure, it's a good chance that your ERG leaders are working without knowing what success is. But now that they have a clear role, it'll be that much easier for them to not only know what success is in their role, but once again, they'll have metrics. So it's not just guessing when they've been successful, but now it's very clear to them and they can feel that sense of pride versus the sense of burnout that a lot of ERG leaders are feeling now, where it's almost like they're running a race with no finish line. So this is the benefit, yet another benefit of a clear role. Reason number 6, enhance communication. So it's going to be easier to identify who to go to in the ERG to get things done if there is a clear leadership structure. This applies not just internally to the ERG leadership team, which it still applies there because now one role will know exactly who to hand off a project to or to hand off the next thing to because there's a person that's designed to pick up. How am I trying to say this in a way that makes sense without giving too much away? Now that each role is supposed to carry out a specific task, once that task is done, they'll know exactly who's responsible for the next task in the process. That's what I'm trying to say. So enhance communication within that leadership team, but also even externally. So when stakeholders want to reach out to your ERG, they'll know exactly, okay, I'm looking here. Here's the lead that's responsible for this action. And it's going to make it that much easier to promote collaboration amongst other ERGs as well. It makes it that much easier for someone to know who to reach out to. There's less barriers in the way of, oh, talk to this person. Oh, I think this person owns it. It's going to be so much clearer. Okay. We went through that. Next one, increase productivity. This is reason number 7. Now that people are focused on a specific task or responsibility, it's going to be that much easier for them to get it done. They can now tunnel vision on one specific task or action item that they're responsible for. And think about it like this. A lot of ERG leaders, and not even think about it, I'm sure you may have experienced this. Like when you ask an ERG leadership team, or if you're an ERG leader, if you ask the team, hey, I really need some help with this. Can someone help throw the event for next month? Let's just say that that's it, hypothetically. And sometimes there's crickets in the channel when that happens. No one's responding. Yeah, it's because no one has to respond. It's no one's specific responsibility to be over the events. So therefore, no one feels the need to volunteer themselves. I'm sure you all have experienced that crickets moment where someone is like, oh, well, now that our ERG leadership structure is just basically everyone jumps in whenever they can, there are times where no one has the capacity to jump in. So then it does not get done. That's the month or months plural where member meetings are skipped, where no communications are sent out. When everyone's accountable, quotation marks, I know you all can't see that, but when everyone's accountable, no one is accountable. So things are going to be so much more productive now that each person has a piece of the pie to execute versus having to feel like in some cases they may even need to take over the whole pie, especially for some ERG leaders. I've been this ERG leader myself where because the ERG wasn't doing anything, I felt the responsibility to like take on the full burden. That doesn't happen anymore when you have a really clear ERG leadership structure. So that burnout that comes from that one person who's like, let me just get the work done, otherwise no one else will do it. It does not happen anymore at all. Last reason, this prepares your ERG program for scale. I purposely put this last too because I do feel strongly that most ERG programs have scaled and jumped the gun way before they were ready. If your ERG leadership structure is in place, there's processes for all of the ERG leader roles. Then when you are interested into scaling into chapters or micro communities, now you have a structure that you know works within your organization. And then it makes sense to scale what's working. I'm a big fan of not scaling what's not working, not scaling mess. And unfortunately, that's where we are in the ERG space right now. But mess no more. We are looking to change that. And I'm assuming that's why you all are here on this podcast, because you're also looking into making your ERG program into a more structured space, something that's sustainable, that can outlive even your tenure and the tenure of all the ERG leaders that exist within your company. That's what I'm hoping to see more of. So let's talk about some questions to assess your ERG leadership structure. Number one, does your ERG structure operate on a specialist or generalist model? We just covered that a little bit. Specialists exercise teamwork and they get things done. So whatever's not in their wheelhouse, they pass to the person who does own that. That helps them to tunnel vision focus on things and they get so much more done. Generalists do everything and they get burnt out. That's question number one. Does your ERG structure operate on a specialist model or a generalist model? Generalist is not the way. Okay, question number two. Do all ERG leaders have a clear understanding of their role and how it contributes to the ERG year round? That year round is a key piece too, not just at certain months. We'll see with the 4C pillar or 4W pillar or whatever pillar method you might be using and why that's not the answer. But to repeat that question, do all leaders on your ERG leadership team have a clear understanding of their role and how it contributes to the ERG's goals year round? Really important. This also kind of touches on SOPs, and because to have a clear understanding of their role, they have to have it documented on how to execute on their role. So we'll get into it. Question number three, are there accountability metrics for each ERG leader to define their success and articulate in their performance reviews? Are there Are there accountability metrics for each ERG leader to define their success and articulate for their performance reviews? That's important. That's a big one. Input and output accountability metrics. Really, we'll get into it. I'm not going to spoil it. Question number four. Does the ERG leadership structure promote collaboration amongst leaders towards a common goal? One more time. Does the leadership structure promote collaboration amongst the leaders towards a common goal? Okay, you all got the questions? So right now we're gonna jump into the 4C, 3W, 3WC. I've seen it called a lot of things, but I'm sure you all know what I'm referencing. For instance, the 4C one is community. There's two more. I should remember honestly more, but I really don't subscribe to the 4C method, which is why, but not that I haven't read up on it, but I just don't subscribe to it at all. And we'll explain why. Or the 3W where it's workplace, workforce. I'm sure you all know exactly what I'm talking about, especially if you operate your ERG on this current model. So let's jump into what's wrong with these models. Why is this not the way? This is also just to put all of these into a bucket. This will be referred to as a pillar-based ERG structure. If you operate your ERG leadership structure under 4C, 3W, that is a pillar-based ERG leadership structure. And that's what we're gonna call them moving forward, just so you all get an idea. And we're going to cover what's wrong with them using those exact 4 questions that we just talked about. So you'll get to see them in practice. And as we do this, you'll kind of be able to compare it to your current leadership structure to see if what I'm saying is accurate, which anyway, we'll get into it. So question number 1, does your ERG structure operate on a specialist or generalist model? With this pillar-based ERG structure, that is a perfect example of a generalist model. You might say how? Because technically they're specializing in community or they're specializing in commerce. But no, what is being missed here is that within each of those pillars exists the need for an event, communications, member engagement, projects, resource sharing, finance. All of those things need to be taken care of within each of those pillars. That means that everyone who's part of your ERG leadership structure, so if one person is responsible for commerce, they have to learn all of those processes. They have to know how to how to pay out a speaker, which sounds like, okay, well, that's not a big thing, but that on top of the fact that they have to know how the best practices for communicating with their audience. They have to put out regular communications to that point. They have to throw an event or do some sort of programming. They have to know how to work with this stakeholder team to bring X thing to life. Everyone has to know every process for each of those pillars. That is wild to me. Because, we talk about it a little bit. I always like to skip ahead because I can really rant and I get really, really passionate about this stuff. But every system that you use, if you use multiple procurement systems, they have to know how to use all of those. Every process, every role that should exist, they have to be masters of it for their specified pillar. And with the volunteer role, keep in mind, ERG leaders are volunteers. This is especially draining. Now it's not just one extra role that they're taking on by being an ERG leader. There's many of them. And like I said, even if this is in a committee form, the same thing works. Even worse, because we do talk about in a second, this whole committee thing that I see a lot in the ERG space and how that's a form of scaling the mess that we talked about earlier. But just know, even if it's a case where you have 4 ERG leaders, each of them are responsible for one of the pillars, they are overwhelmed with the thought of doing all of those things. They have to master all of those things. So that's question number 1 in of itself. Question number 2. Question is, do all ERG leaders have a clear understanding of their role and how it contributes to the ERG year round? So we already touched on the fact that they already don't have a clear understanding, likely, because they have to do a ton of things, or that they clearly have too much to do. But let's talk about this year-round piece even. With pillars, there's a good chance, typically when companies implement pillars, they also leave it almost to the ERG leaders to decide how frequently they want to engage these pillars. This can be like them saying, oh, once a quarter, like this quarter will focus on commerce, this quarter will focus on community. Or they might do monthly even, where they're just doing a rotating of each of those pillars. So with that, let's just go hypothetically with the quarterly, which is the lesser, because all these things that I'm about to say still applies with the monthly, but it's just amplified. Actually, do I want to do it like that? Let's do it reverse. Let's start with monthly, because the same thing also applies with quarterly. So if the ERG leaders were to go by this 4C model and say, we'll rotate this on a monthly basis. So January is one pillar, February 1, March 1, April 1. That means I, as the community person, and we activate that in January, am not actively engaged in the ERG again until 4 months later. So until May. So now 4 months have gone by, the ERG has done stuff, and I'm still a volunteer, keep in mind. And now I have to execute something else on community. While I do that, I have to, once again, my role consists of everything. So I have to think about how I'm going to engage from a communication standpoint, from an event standpoint, from a finance standpoint, all these things. And it's been 4 months, so I might not remember every process. And there's a good chance that if you are going by the pillar method, that you don't have these things documented. You don't have documentation that explains how to do each of these things. I rarely see that where the documentation exists. So now they have to kind of remember, they might have to ask a lot of people, they might have to ask for help just because you have not made it easy for them to execute upon their role. So I'm expected to do all this and not drop the ball. Also, if there's been any new learnings from January to May, I have to know what those things are. If the strategy for the ERG program, which, let's be honest, likely doesn't exist, but if there have been changes to the strategy over the last 4 months, any learnings, I'm supposed to somewhat align to those. I am overwhelmed in this case. And guess what? Even if this is executed, I'm likely going to be burnt out as well by the end of it. And honestly, and then I'll be looking forward to that 3-month break in between. Do you all see the problem with that? It's so important to engage ERG leaders year round. And even worse, I'm not even gonna say worse because it's almost like equally bad. Let's just say hypothetically, you have all 4 of these pillars going every single month where you're saying, oh, well, we are engaging our ERG leaders year round because we want to see examples of all these 4 pillars every month, or something is always in the works. Now we have to really think about the user experience. I mean, truly, one of the things I say a lot is if you confuse, you lose. And with all these things being thrown at your ERG's members, not to mention if you have chapters, which would throw additional things at your ERG's members, not to mention for the other ERGs that exist within your company, throwing this level of programming and things at your ERG's members. And with all that being said, because there is so much for each pillar that ERG leaders are probably dropping the ball on some of those things, the member experience is horrible. And I don't think that we think about this enough in terms of how are we engaging the people who are within the ERG? We look at it from a perspective of someone who's leading an ERG, but rarely do we ever say, for the person who is a member of our community, what would this look like? Would this look messy? Would it feel like too much is going on? Am I able to clearly understand what the goals are of this ERG? There's so many lingering questions, and we're only on question number 2. Okay, question number 3. Are there accountability metrics for each ERG leader to define their success and articulate for their performance review? Well, obviously not. Or you can say there's already no consistency, likely, because there's so much burden put on each person or each pillar. So because there's no consistency, it's hard to really, obviously the accountability metrics, if they do exist, would show not great things. And unfortunately, when the accountability metrics do show the gaps and the lack of performance, we almost pivot away from them. It's almost shameful to see. And so it makes us want to not even share or be consistent with these accountability metrics because it makes us, people who lead the ERG program, look bad. But in all reality, we know that if we put in place something that said, how consistently does this ERG do these things, it would be extremely inconsistent. So there's no accountability metrics. For the metrics, and then for the metrics and things that you are measuring, let's again go back to that monthly cadence of you do 1 pillar per month and you rotate. With that, each month now, it's almost like you're trying to perfect a recipe, and every single time a different cook comes in and you don't come in to check your recipe again until 4 months later. Every cook is different. So what do I mean by that? With your ERG, let's just say that one of the metrics that you're looking at is your event attendance and engagement. because there's not one person responsible for your events, with each different pillar, that's going to show something different in engagement, because that's obviously going to impact your ERG in different ways. So now you're going to try to gain learnings from previous things that have happened, but it's been so spread apart that you've done two things that are based around the commerce pillar. So you don't really have something solid to base your progress or your hypothetical learnings that you want to apply on. You're applying something and saying, oh, last month we only had 20% of our ERG engaged, but it was something that maybe the problem wasn't the fact that it was the event or the event time zone. Maybe it was just the sheer fact that your ERG isn't ready for commerce. So now you're trying to do community and you're freaking out and you're trying to change the time zone and saying that must be the problem. Or really, the problem could just be the fact that it's the pillar approach. People might like your pillar the best. It's hard to really identify learnings consistently when there's different people doing it at all times. And in this case, you're only really activated. Once again, if we go by the rotating monthly, you're only really activated 3 times a year. And in that case, it's going to be the same 3 times a year. So there's also learnings missed here. So if you're activating in January and May, then you'll never actually know if the commerce pillar is best applied in March at the end of the quarter. There's so many learnings that are just missed with the pillar method. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Like I said, I'm trying not to rant because I'm trying to get us to have at least 15 minutes of Q&A. So, did I cover everything for that question, Vance? Yeah, we kind of touched on everything. Last question for the 4C model. Does the leadership structure promote collaboration amongst the ERG leaders towards a common goal? With this pillar-based approach, the answer, quite frankly, is no. It increases confusion, but really to answer that question, it increases the amount of silos that exist within an ERG's leadership team. Really, these 4 pillars all have separate goals at the end of the day. So now your ERG is working towards 4 goals a year versus what I'm recommending to you all, which is have your ERG focus on one major impact goal. Really have your ERG program focus on one impact goal, but at minimum, the ERG itself trying to accomplish 4 goals, which is now weighed on 4 people, or in some cases, yes, there's bigger teams, but because it's scaled mess 9 times out of 10, those teams really aren't productive. So, let me not rant, go back to it. But anyway, it really does, that's not where I was at. So yeah, now you're trying to do 4 goals. Everyone has a different goal. So no, your ERG leaders, the communication is not even promoted because I'm so focused on driving impact on the commerce side that community, well, that's their lane. I'm not even going to step into it. Where really you all need to communicate more because you're still doing all the same things. You're still all doing communications. You're still all doing events. You're still all trying to recognize your members in the best way. As a bonus, I will also say your ERG program likely is not even ready for this pillar-based, for this 4C, 4W model. If you read up on the ERG movement model, which I highly recommend, I promise you. Anyway, if you read up on it, you'll see that I really push in the infancy and adolescent stage up to mid-adolescence. It should really just be focused on benefiting your members. That is the key. You have to have member buy-in in order to get business impact, in order to do a lot of these other impact things. So a lot of the time, you all are pressuring your ERG leaders to do things when your program is not at all ready in a place to execute on these things. This workplace, workforce, commerce, those big ones that stand out in my brain, because a lot of ERG leaders come to me all the time and say, I'm being pushed to drive this business impact, but I don't even know what that means. I don't know how to do it, or progress isn't being made at the rate that I'm being pushed to do it. They keep saying that they want business impact, but I don't know how. here's the thing that I see so often is there's a push for business impact and things like that, and you have this pillar-based method, but what you have not done is actually invested any time in creating these SOPs that I always talk about, standardized operating procedures that explain clearly for the volunteer ERG leader how to execute on that. So, okay, if you're going to demand that there's business impact, you need to have already put in the work to partner with those teams and to create a fleshed out plan on how an ERG leader is going to partner with those teams moving forward. If you have not done that, you can't tell ERG leaders, oh, go make business impact. And that is so hurtful to the program. It leads to burnout so quickly because 9 times out of 10, even when an ERG leader does have an idea of what business impact can look like, the business might not be ready for it and likely is not. So now they're trying to increase representation of some of their community numbers by X%, and the recruiting team has a completely different focus for this year. So now they come back to you frustrated, and you're still putting this pressure on them to bring back some result. It is exhausting to the ERG leader, and this brings out ERG burnout so frequently. When you are passionate to do something and you constantly run into these stops and steps that prevent you from being able to do it. I'm trying not to I get really passionate about this because I've been an ERG leader. I lead an ERG program now. I work with ERG program leaders, and I see the same thing so frequently. This is why the ERG movement is here, because it's time that we do things better, which means doing things differently. And there's some accountability that a lot of us have to take in the space where we understand that there's a process to this. We have to approach this in a systematic way. And it's just such a lazy approach just to put together a model and then put pressure on ERG leaders to execute on it without us taking the time to do the work to make it easy for them to execute. So it's okay. Let me just calm myself down. We'll go through one more really quickly. I'll just talk about this general co-chair, co-president situation, because I do see that a lot too, where there are no clear roles, but it's oh yeah, no, we're just the ERG leaders, or we're just the co-presidents, and that's all the ERG leadership consists of. Question number 1, is it a generalist or specialist model? I'm sure you all get it's completely a generalist model when you do that. So the 3 people, let's just hypothetically go with a company that has 3 people in an ERG, and they're all 3 co-presidents. They're all generalists. None of them specialize in anything for the ERG. They all just hop in whenever they can. Question number 2. Gotta go back to question 2. Do all leaders have a clear understanding of how their role contributes to the ERG year-round? No, they don't. Yet again, they don't have SOPs in place, because if they did, you can't SOP the same role 3 times. This is the same exact situation as the pillar-based model, but now potentially, they don't have the restraints of operating within a pillar, which is maybe worse, maybe better, depends on how you take it. But now there is still no accountability for all of those things that I mentioned exist, that an ERG leader needs, that an ERG needs to operate. There's still no accountability for the programming, for the events, for the communications, for who pays out the speaker, for who sets up this community event. There's no accountability at all. Burnout will happen so quick. Well, actually, you know what? Depending on how many people. Sometimes it works at first that people are just chipping in when they can, but burnout will eventually happen, because 9 times out of 10, eventually there's one person who's truly, 1, maybe 2 people who are carrying the ERG, and that will exhaust someone. I've been there. I've seen it as well. So that's thing 2. Question number 3, in terms of metrics, are there accountability metrics for each ERG leader to define their success and articulate in their performance review? No. Where do we even start when it's just 3 people who hop in and do what they can? No assignment means no assigned success, which means failure. Ultimately, there's no accountability, as we just said, so therefore no one can be accountable for success metrics and in good conscience put that on their performance review and say, oh, I moved this needle when likely, they contributed to it a little bit, but there's just no accountability for someone to really own that needle. Okay, question number 4, because we're going through anyway. Okay, question number 4. Does the ERG leadership structure promote collaboration amongst leaders towards a common goal? No, communication, sure, because there's only like a few people on the team, 3 people, but there's no clarity. So that's eventually going to lead to frustration and burnout. Other things to be aware of, chapter leads. I don't think we have time to get into this, so we're going to have to do that on a different session. But what I will do, I'll say just really quickly, things to be aware of is chapters. So localizing mess, which is what I mean when I say scaling mess. When I say mess, I mean a leadership structure that's not clear, that doesn't have accountability metrics, that doesn't have SOP. Committees, the committee piece, I kind of touched on that too. That's also another version of scaling mess. Having too big of a team is something else to be aware of. It will lead to burnout. It will lead to low engagement. It will make decision-making and action-taking so much slower. So, okay. Here's the ERG leadership structure you need. Remember, rule number 1 of the ERG movement is that ERGs must operate as a business enterprise. All companies, all business enterprises have CEOs, COOs, CFOs, CMOs. All these things mean something really, but we're not going to go into too much on what these things mean, but I'll explain how it translates into ERGs. First, the top of the structure, hopefully your ERG program has this, which is an ERG DRI. That's how I refer to it. ERG, directly responsible individual. That should be the ERG program manager. As the ERG program manager or community manager, you're part of this ERG leadership structure. Just for all of the ERGs, just like how someone who leads a company with multiple subsidiaries is still the leader, that's who you are in this. So you're like the CEO who has the overall vision of the ERG program. I talk about this a lot with having a very clear vision. All the ERGs across the program should also be aligned to this vision. You're going to really double down on creating a strategy, creating the big, how are you going to get from point A to point B to point Z when it comes to reaching your vision with the timeline. That's all your responsibility. And the ERG leaders will look to you to execute upon this. A lot of programs don't have this, I acknowledge. And therefore, they don't have a clear vision. Like I mentioned, it's like running a race with no finish line. It's exhausting. So I'll just say honestly, if that's the case for you, just hit me up. We can have a conversation about I don't know. I can help at least create your ERG vision for your specific ERG, because there's a good chance then that all of your ERGs are not aligned on the same thing. I have great compassion for people who are in that situation. So I'm always even if you're not in that situation, I'm always willing to talk. But anyway, I'm not gonna go into it. Co-chairs. Let's talk about that. We talked about why just co-chairs is bad if there's no deeper meaning. But co-chairs are still important, or co-presidents, whatever you may call them. Honestly, I'm even pivoting away from the chairs piece, but we'll talk about that another day in terms of the name. But you need someone, can be 2 people, who manage the ERG. Just like in a business, there's these executives and then there's the managers who still hold people accountable. That is what the co-chairs are in this case. What do? They ensure execution of the ERG leaders. They hold people accountable to their metrics and to their specific role duties. They ensure smooth operations of the ERGs. They cascade information from the ERG DRI, so the program manager, on big picture strategy things down to the rest of the leadership team, and vice versa. They bubble up concerns as well. They host the ERG leadership meetings. 3 things that I really say are the principles of what a co-chair should be. 1, what they should do. 1, they should lead. So set the standard, manage performance of the rest of the ERG leadership team. 2, they should support the team. So provide feedback, implement advice on how to implement the strategies, once again, that are coming from that ERG program manager. Encourage the leaders when needed, because sometimes you do need, just some support, even just an emotional support piece. They meet with the rest of the ERG leadership team regularly just to do like a check-in. Like I said, this could be for emotional, this could be like for their role executing upon it, but that's what they do as support people. And thing 3, they represent the ERG. So there's a good chance that the ERG co-chair is the most visible role of the ERG. They likely have a closer relationship with the executives, and also they're the first point of contact when stakeholders reach out to the ERG program. So they do a lot here. What should their SOP include? Their standardized operating procedure. So for every ERG co-chair, if you have this role within your organization, when you create this document that explains what the procedures are of their role, this should include how to host leadership meetings. That is like so slept on right now. I can't even get into it, but maybe we'll put that as a future podcast episode. How to actually host the leadership meetings effectively. You should provide them with a report card or some way to hold people accountable. How do they know what's going on in the ERG at all times, and how are they holding people accountable to their metrics? Also, when it comes to their metrics specifically, there's 2 types of metrics, and I'll just touch on them briefly. There's input metrics that hold them accountable, and output metrics. Input metrics, that is what they have done. Like, have they done X amount of things, or have they done this thing? An output metric will be a result of them doing those things. Okay, so for ERG co-chairs, what an input metric would be. For an input metric, that would be number of check-in meetings that they've had with their ERG leadership team. So has every member of the ERG leadership team been checked in on, whether it be in a one-on-one meeting or even just via Slack, via email? Have you actually communicated with your team this month? Yes or no? So if they have 6 people on the team, they need to have 6 check-in points throughout the month, 1 per person. Has that been done? That's a metric, right? Has the ERG leadership meeting for this month been held? Not the member meeting, but just the leadership meeting where they're talking to the other ERG leaders. Has it been done? Yes or no? That's also a form of a metric as well. Now that's something that you can hold them accountable for have they done X thing. Output metric would be, what is the percentage of the completion of the ERG report card? So of all these tasks that need to be done within the ERG, how many of them have actually been done? Output metrics, they don't have direct control over, but input metrics, so by them checking in on people frequently, by them holding this well-structured ERG leadership meeting, will greatly influence whether those output metrics reflect. Hopefully you all are following me here. Okay, that is the co-chair. Communications chair. Really big on communications. I really want to say this. Do not have your ERG leaders only communicate with the members when they want something. And that's what I see so frequently right now. Have the ERG leaders provide resources. These are employee resource groups. So provide some resources to the members. Resources could be information. It could be connections. It could be news. There's so many things that apply here, but that's what the communication share is all about. They consistently engage the members. They engage in internal marketing. That's a concept I'm really big on. How are you marketing to members who are already there? That would be like customer experience, almost in a sense, or at least part of it. Daily communications, providing resources like I mentioned, opportunities to connect with other people in the community via questions or other types of programming. They would also likely maintain your ERG's website or your ERG hub. It's not newsletters and event updates. That's not communications. It's so much more than that. So their SOP for the communication share would include a playbook on how to boost engagement with communications. Give them some tips on best communication practices within your organization and what communication looks like. Give them some thought starters that explain, like, okay, so you want to engage your community with some questions. You want to ask some fun questions to get people talking. Here are some ideas, or here's some websites to find ideas. This way they have something to go off. Give them some template messages that they can use and customize for their ERG. Give them a dashboard that will help them to see the accountability metrics that they're responsible for. Give them a content calendar and explain how to complete it. This way they can batch create messaging for the month to engage their community. And really important, like I said, instructions on how to complete it. So yeah, next, and what metrics are they accountable for? Input metrics would be number of communications. You should require a certain amount of number per month, per weekday, per something, but a specific number. This way they know when they hit the goal, because now that they've hit that number, that means that they did good. Also, by X date, so have these amount of communications completed by this date. Boom. Input metric. Output metric. What is the Slack engagement score? What is the Slack active membership score? I say Slack, but the same thing applies to Teams. Both platforms have metrics. I talk about it. It's on the ERG Movement, so you can check it out where I talk more about how to get that. But what is the current score? What is the benchmark for that score? I typically recommend 25% Slack engagement score or channel engagement score, which means that 1 in 4 people who actually open up the channel react or post in the channel. These are things that they can now be accountable for, so you can measure engagement. Engagement is such a buzzword in the ERG space, but we want to bring some meaning to it with metrics. If you're not really big, like a company who's like really heavy on Slack or Teams or whatever communication channel, you can also do like email open rate or the frequency or percentage of members who have opened up your ERG website, in case you also have metrics on that, which many platforms do. So that's it for the communications lead. And we're kind of running through it because we're running out of time. Events lead, really big. I mean, ERGs are not just events. Let's be very clear. But events are important to it. That's members coming together to connect, to network, to build that community. So event is a really big thing. And that's why all these things that I'm talking about, as you notice, think about how that currently applies to your current ERG leadership structure and the gaps, because all of these things aren't clear to your ERG leaders, why things might be dropped. So for the ERG events lead, they need to show up consistently for the members. Regular engagement that's planned in advance. You want to deliver on the wants and needs of your members, which hopefully you ask your members why they're joining your ERG, what they hope to get out of it, and the ERG events leads can then deliver on that. Okay, perfect. What should their SOP include? Just a couple of them I'm going to touch on. How to reach out to speakers, how to reach out to even internal panelists, how to set up an event, templates that they might need, whether it's a slide deck template or a communication template. Not even communication in a communication type way, but communication like if they wanted to announce something at an event, what that might look like. A timeline on, like, as you work to complete an event, when should, like 3 weeks in advance, what should be done? 2 weeks in advance, what should be done? That should be also in your SOP. How to work with the communications team. So when do you pass things on to them? How to ensure that the event doesn't overlap with other company programming. How, really, when it comes to this, outline what all of the steps of a successful event are. Very detailed. Write it out, and then write out all the details on how to make it happen. It might seem obvious, but so many cases, there's this thing called the gift of knowledge. I won't go into it too much, but really because it's normal to us and it makes sense to us, and it's like, duh, that's not always the case. It's just because we already know the process. We need to have this documented. Anyway, okay, metrics. Input metrics would be number of events planned by X date. I would say for ERG leaders, they should have 1 event planned 3 months out. That's like the input metric. Is your event for 3 months out planned? And this is if you're doing like a monthly cadence for membership engagement. But do you have this plan in advance? I really say 3 months out. Like, that's so key, because a lot of the time members aren't able to engage because things have been like sprung up on them last minute. But if you have this process in place, it's going to be so easy for them to actually execute on these plans. You're going to take all the think work out of doing ERG stuff, and not even the think work, but we'll keep it think work, because then ERG leaders can now just come in with the creative pieces, with the really community specific pieces, and talk about and like plug in the things that are going to really customize this ERG and deliver on members' wants and needs. Okay. Anyway, so have they planned an event by X date, at least one event, if that's the requirement. Or like for Heritage Months, maybe the requirement is 4 events. And you need to have them like planned out like 2 months in advance. Who knows what it is, but you need to make that very clear in the process. This way they know, oh wow, I planned out 2 events 2 months in advance. I'm like doing really good. Or I didn't plan an event and I'm over the deadline, so I should get started on that. It makes sense when they say that I'm not doing my role. Output metric for events, so many things can be factored in here. Percent of members that have attended a ERG event, and it could just be for that specific event, or it could be for a year. Like in the past year, what's the percent of members who have actually attended an event? If that number is low, that means that's a clear indicator that likely either an event hasn't been planned as frequently as it should have, or that the events aren't delivering on the needs of the members. But you don't know unless you have this down. Thing 2, NPS, if you do NPS scores for your event, or watch time. I'm big on watch time, especially because NPS can be hard to be consistent with. I mean, not necessarily if you have an SOP in place, but with the watch time, what's the percentage of the watch time for the event? What is the percentage of people who have engaged globally? How does that break down by country? These are all things that can exist if you have the data, which you already do, I guarantee. If you use Teams or Zoom, you already have this data guaranteed, but your ERG leaders don't know how to use it, or it's not being visualized for them, and they're definitely not held to it. So that's important too. Last piece, with 2 minutes left, I talk about a member engagement lead. And this is a newer train of thought, but where you might have actually been thinking I was going to say finance. But finance is such a small portion. You can opt to keep that and make member engagement separate. Member engagement will be how are you engaging your members outside of events and communications. This is kind of the other piece of that customer experience that a business would typically go through. So projects, a community service, member recognition. How are you recognizing your members? And then also finance too. So their SOP would include step-by-step procurement, how to execute, and like pay out a speaker, or if you have like 2 separate procurement systems, which I see a lot, how to actually pay. Like, what if I want to pay with a card? What happens then? How do I submit expenses to the business and to the ERG DRI if they exist? How do I view the budget at any given time? All these things should already be built. Just imagine with the pillar method, like how all of this that I talked about, all these SOPs, every single ERG leader would have to know. Okay, we're not going to go into it. Some metrics that they're accountable for. Input would be the percent of the budget spent per quarter, because think about it like this, a lot of ERGs like have a ton of money left over at the end of the year, but really if you told them in advance, this quarter you should have, because it's the first quarter of the year, you should have a quarter of your budget spent then, hypothetically. So you can hold them to that input metric of how much of that is spent and how it was spent potentially. And then as an output metric, it can be like, what was the result? Like, what did this boost engagement? Like, they can tie each of those spends to a result. Okay, I'm done. I hate that we can't do Q&A because like this was such a lengthy topic, but we're right at time, and I appreciate you all for hopping on. Make sure that you tune in next week. We do this every week, and I promise I'll leave time for Q&A next time. Thanks again for hopping on.